Shalom, everyone, and welcome to week 18 of Coffee and Connection. And excited, yes, here I am. So I got kicked off for a minute. I would love to get into the Purim spirit a little bit and share some ideas. Um, It's awesome. I'm just getting some private messages on people being able to be here. I'm so happy to have you. So, what I'd like to talk about today is some of the lessons. A few years ago, I gave a talk in England, actually, two places in England on Esther and what it is that we can learn from her in our relationships. And it's an amazing thing. Oh, hello. Did you just wake up? Oh, no. Abba just left. Go, you want to go lie down with Yiska? Want to go lie down with Yiska? Or you want to sit on the couch? My son fell asleep early and now he's awake. There's all these people on Zoom. Okay. I guess he's joining us today. Okay. So should we tell Abba that you're awake? Let's tell Abba you're awake. Oh, yeah. Go with Yiska. Yiska's gonna read you a story.
No.
Okay, let's see if he'll go back to sleep. I don't know. Okay. Let me just here take just message Abba telling him that he's awake and then go to sleep. Okay. So where we're yes, real life happens, Baruch Hashem. Oh, you want to go with her? You want to go with her? What? Yeah. No, you want to go play? Mm-hmm. Okay, no. Okay. So oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. I said only the other thing. Okay. You my network. Okay, Baruch Hashem. Oh, no, you can't. No. Okay. Okay, sorry. I lost service. Okay. So here we go. Let's talk about okay, the amazing thing about what it is actually possible. You know, Torah, Navi, Ketuvim, it's amazing how we can actually learn things from what's going it's not just about the stories. We're not just learning stories. We're not just learning about the past. We're not just learning about the past or we're we're actually can see from these stories, see from what happens in these books, how we can actually live our lives today, right? What we can actually understand about relationships today. It's an amazing thing, right? Because we often don't think of it. After I gave that talk, I was talking to a woman and I said, yeah, I was just in England and I was giving this talk on Esther and what we learned from her about relationships. And she was like, she had no idea like that was even possible. She's like, what do you mean? What do you mean we can learn from Esther about relationships, like about putting on like perfume and makeup? Like, because that's what it says that she did before, they would go to the king. And I was like, no. And I started telling her some of these ideas. And it's an amazing thing when we can really feel the Tanakh coming alive in our lives. So that's what I'd like to do a little bit today. And I was looking at my list of questions that I have that everyone has sent in to have answered on these calls. I saw how so many of those questions can be addressed through what I'm going to share with you today. So the focus of this idea I don't know if we're going to get through all of it. We may do some of it tonight and some of it next week before Purim. But the idea is looking at what Esther did in that moment of truth, right? When Mordecai came to her and said, "This is a situation. What are you going to do about it?" There's something that happened within Esther that we can see so clearly. Because until that moment, in the whole book, until that moment, we see that Esther was a very passive woman who did what was necessary, who did what was asked of her and what was told of her. We see her being taken. First, we see her raised by Mordecai. She does what Mordecai tells her. She goes as as Achashverosh demands, and she's doing what she's told. And when Mordecai says to her, you know, this is perhaps this is why you're here, and this is what you need to do something to help us. She starts telling everyone else what to do. She suddenly steps in. In a second, she becomes the leader of the Jewish people. And she sets up a 3-step process to change the fate of the Jewish world. She sets in place 3 things. The first thing she does is she says, everyone's going to take, and she's telling everyone what to do, right? 3 days for fasting and tshuva. Then she goes to Achashverosh and tells him, that she's inviting him to her house. And then she has the feast where she has the whole plot with the 2 feasts, and eventually names Haman as her enemy and has him killed. So let's go through that 3-step plot and see what we can learn from that in terms of how we can handle situations in our lives when we're feeling perhaps overwhelmed, when we're feeling disconnected, right? This was definitely not a pleasant experience for Esther, right? And yet she was able to use these 3 steps, to be able to create a different reality in her life, not just for herself, but for the entire Jewish people. So, what is it that she did? Right. The irony here is that I'm not in my room because he was sleeping in my room. So I'm out here because he was sleeping. So now I'm I have him here and I can't go and escape from him. Okay, so where I just want to have here we go. So the first thing that she did, the first thing that she does, the first thing that we can learn from her is the necessity to self-nourish when feeling stressed, overwhelmed, or emotionally charged, right? There are many times in our lives, I'm sure there's many times today, that we have felt that we feel stressed, we feel overwhelmed, we feel pressured, we feel sad, we feel just that overwhelming sense of like, there's so much to do, or there's so much that needs to get done, or there's so much on my head right now. What do we do in that moment when it feels like there's just so much on us? What Esther showed us is that we don't just jump into trying to do what we need to do. Because in that moment, we're too overwhelmed. It's too much. And what do we do when we're overwhelmed, right? A confused mind does nothing, as my coach always says. A confused mind does nothing. An overwhelmed mind cannot function. We don't properly function in that moment, whether because we're in our like survival brain in that moment. So we're not making our higher brain choices. We're not making our neshama choices in that moment. We are, we're in stress. We're in survival. We're going to do what comes way more naturally to us, way more, in our nature than who we want to be. We aren't making the same conscious choices in that moment when we are overwhelmed. And when we can take time to take a deep breath, as I see some of you doing right here on the camera. Take a deep breath and think, relax, even for a moment. It makes a huge difference in what we're going to be able to accomplish and how we're going to behave, who we're going to be. And that, doesn't need to be a 3-day process. So we see 3 days over and over again in Tanakh and as a deliberation to think something through. But sometimes that process in our quick day by day lives is going to be a 3-second process where we're going to take a deep breath and then we're going to move forward. And even as we move forward, what I'd like to suggest, and we can see from Esther, is that it's important to do something in that moment to help us get strength, to help us get in touch with who I am and why am I doing this, to help us feel good about ourselves so we can be the women we want to be. So if we're feeling overwhelmed, right, we look around, we say, oh my gosh, this place is a mess. I need to clean it up. Or, oh my gosh, I got to get dinner ready. Or, oh my gosh, I have so much work to do. Or, oh my goodness, I need to, put the kids to bed and I feel like I'm going to fall on my face. Or whatever it is. What can we do? The first thing is to notice I'm feeling whatever it is. I'm feeling stressed. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Feel that feeling. Even put our hands where we're feeling it in our body, right? Whether it's in our heads or in our chest, on our stomach, right? You put your hand there for a moment. It helps you bring awareness to what's going on. You're moving from that natural, animalistic, habitual brain into your conscious brain where you can make those higher level decisions of how you want to be and who you want to be. So you take a second to recognize what I am feeling. And then you take you take a step to nourish yourself, to return yourself back to who you want to be. Right? For Esther, it was a 3-day tshuva process. She didn't just jump into her plan. She told everyone we have to take time to figure out why is this happening and who are we and who do we want to be. That's what fasting is always about, right? It's not just about being hungry. It's about getting in touch with that, our higher side. So she took that time. So taking that moment, whether it's you say, I'm going to sit and have a cup of coffee, I'm going to get a drink of water, I'm going to take a few deep breaths, something to nourish ourselves and respect where we're at so that we can figure out who we want to be. And then we can take one step forward into what needs to be done, right? Whenever something seems so big, we even see this. Like Esther had to save the Jewish people. She didn't barge into Achashverosh's room and say, my people are going to be killed and it's your fault. No, she had a plan. She had a process. And after those 3 days, she took the next step. She took a step forward into having, to get done what needs to get done. So practically, we see from this in our lives the importance of self-nourishment, recognition and self-nourishment in that moment of stress. It's okay. Recognition and self-nourishment. We have to realize what's going on. Otherwise, that feeling of like, I didn't even realize that I was in stress mode. I didn't even realize that I was triggered. I didn't even realize that I was overwhelmed. It just felt like I was just being me. I was just saying how I felt. And then afterwards, you have that feeling of like, oh my gosh, what did I do? Right? What did I say? What did I like? Who do I have to say I'm sorry to? Right? Like, what was that? So taking that time to realize how we feel and give ourselves the opportunity to refresh and calm down. And then what did she do? She goes to Achashverosh. Now, what she was doing in that moment was absolutely terrifying for her on so many levels. She was risking her life. She was, negating her level of being with Achashverosh by force. She was taking responsibility on her shoulders for so many people and for so much. And what she did is she went in and she expressed herself from a vulnerable place. She said, I would love for you to come. She was in that moment, in that vulnerable state. We learned that Achashverosh was so overcome by her beauty that he was willing to do anything for her, right? She really walked in a state of regal and dignified power, right? And our issues, what we're dealing with in that moment is not, it's true. It's not of such importance. It's not like we're taking on the lives of the Jewish people. But we also have to recognize that for us in our lives, whatever we're dealing with is what we're dealing with. It's real. Sometimes we get to that place of feeling like, I'm not allowed to be worried about this. I'm not allowed to be upset about this. How could I get overwhelmed by, X, Y, and Z when so much horrible stuff is happening in the world? And sometimes we can give ourselves perspective, but sometimes it ends up with us ends up with us denying our feelings, denying what's true for us. And we're allowed to struggle. We have our struggles, and yet we can learn that, most of us are not going to be asked to be Esther. And yet, the fact that we have the story of Esther tells us that we are meant to learn from that, even though we're not going to be in that place. So I'm getting a message here of like that feeling of like I have to suck it up and do it, and don't take the time to do the wait. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe you'll correct it. But when we tell ourselves like, "Oh, suck it up, it's such a small thing," that's that could be a very subtle way that we are denying our feelings and denying that we have struggles. We have struggles, we have to be honest with our struggles. And sometimes we may be able to say, "Oh, this is so nothing. Like, why am I making such a big deal out of it?" And sometimes that works. And many times it's just a way that we're making it as if what we're dealing with doesn't matter. And it does matter. We matter. Our feelings matter. Now, sometimes you're like, why wasn't I so upset that somebody, you know, um, I don't know, someone left the food out? Like, why am I so upset that someone left the pot of soup out? It's such a little thing. What am I getting so upset about? But then you can ask yourself, well, what does that mean to me that someone left the pot of soup out? Does it mean I don't feel heard? Maybe that's a struggle for me, feeling heard, feeling cared about, feeling appreciated for the work that went into making that soup. Maybe, it seems small, but it's really a symptom of a larger issue. And by recognizing that issue, I can take steps to work through it. I can deal with that feeling, even if it's within myself, right? And remember that what was the first thing Esther did? She didn't run to Achashverosh. She said we have to work through this through ourselves. What are we doing? What do we need to do tshuva for? Now, I'm not talking about blaming ourselves, but so often, so much of what's bothering us is because of how we're filtering it through our stories, through our limiting beliefs, through our triggers. And once we work through that, then we can go and deal with it on the outside, right, with other people in our relationships in a way that they can hear it, in a way that we can work together to deal with the issue. Just pretending like we don't have problems and saying, ah, it's so little comparatively. Remember, if the only reason, if the only way we can learn from Esther is if we're in her shoes, well, then, we wouldn't need to have that story. Okay. Then we wouldn't need to have that story. The fact that it's there means that, the only books we have in Tanakh are books that we can all learn from in every generation. So we're meant to recognize that our issues that we're dealing with, our struggles, they matter. And here is a way for us to deal with those struggles in a way that we can be dignified and and successful. So what did Esther do? She went to Achashverosh and she expressed her request, and she was very calm in these moments. Now, we know that she was terrified. We have sources that talk about how terrified she was. This was terrifying. And yet we see that when she speaks to him, she speaks calmly, and she speaks in a very like she's worked it through. She's worked through her fears. She's worked through her struggles. And it's amazing the difference that that can make, right? Even when we're upset, I'll say, especially when we're upset, okay, when we are upset and we come to the person we're upset with all of those feelings in a way that, like, that's an expression, if we haven't worked it through, and we come in that full, like, rage or that full anger, frustration, then it's actually very hard for the other person to hear us. So if you ever have that feeling of like, why don't you just listen to me? Why is it that when I tell you how I feel, you ignore me or you push it away or it turns into a fight? If you feel like your expressions of your feelings turn into fights, then very often that is because of the way we're expressing ourselves. And this is not a make wrong. It's just a learn. It's a tool to be able to express yourself and feel heard. If you want to feel heard, then what we can do instead is to first work through our feelings and then come with our feelings as an expression of vulnerability instead of from anger or frustration. So, and what can happen in that moment is instead of it turning into a fight, it can turn into a moment of understanding. It can turn into a moment of, like, recognition of, like, oh, that's how you're feeling, or oh, that was your intention, I didn't realize it, right? And it may be that he won't receive it, because it's always hard for people to hear that there's something bothering us, like, it's always hard for someone to hear that there's something they did that upset us. And yet, when we can come with in a vulnerable way, then even if they can't hear us in that moment, we can stay in our dignity, stay in who we want to be, and give them the space to process it themselves, right? And we actually see this. We see how Esther gives Ahasuerus the space to process the information in his own way. She doesn't jump in and tell him what to do. She doesn't, like, she just, like, gives him that space to process and decide how he's going to handle it. And very often that is such an important part of this process. It's such an important part of the equation where we can express ourselves and then we get so frustrated. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't apologize. He didn't hear me. He argued with me. What are you doing? He argued with me. He told me I was wrong, sweetie pie. He told me I was wrong for feeling that way, right? And that's very frustrating because we often come to these conversations with a bit of an expectation of how we think he should respond. And what I invite you to do is to remember that it is hard for anyone to hear that they did something wrong. And when we express, if we've expressed our feelings, we've expressed what's going on for us, we can give them the space to process it, knowing that the important thing is that we've made our feelings known. We've communicated. And even if we don't get an apology in that moment, even if we get a, well, that shouldn't have bothered you, or what's wrong with you that that upset you, or, how could you be so sensitive or shallow or whatever, we can not get into a fight. I expressed myself. We can make communication our intention. And that gives them the space to then process what it is that we've said. And then they know. Maybe they'll apologize later. Maybe they'll take our feelings, hopefully, they'll take our feelings into account. But there's nothing more that we can do. We can't control how they're going to receive it and what they're going to say. We can control who we're going to be and how we're going to communicate. And that is more important than not communicating at all, right? Not communicating at all is it's like it's not fair to anyone when including ourselves when we don't communicate. But that doesn't mean that we have to get into fights about things. We can communicate clearly and vulnerably, and we can choose not to engage in a discussion afterwards about whether or not our feelings are right or wrong, right? We can express ourselves and let go of how they're going to respond. Now, this is definitely a bigger discussion that we could talk about for hours, but just to sum up the first 2 points, and we'll do the third one, which is an amazing seeing how Esther had understanding of her husband that allowed her to give him space to make his decisions in a beautiful way. We'll talk about that next week. But just to sum up the first two, what she did is first taking time to nourish and get into a more positive space for herself. And we learn from that when we're feeling overwhelmed, it's so important for us to recognize that, to be aware of our challenges, and then to give ourselves time to recenter and calm ourselves down and relax, whether it's because we feel overwhelmed about our own life or we feel overwhelmed with our feelings against someone else. And then once we've done that, we can take a step forward, and we can, if it's about, something we can do in our lives, we can take a practical one step in the right direction. And if it's about something that's bothering us with others, as Esther then went and communicated vulnerably, even though she was so overwhelmed with her feelings and so scared. And so, I mean, she must have been, I mean, we don't know exactly what, we just know she very much, there was a lot of fear. She was able to stay in a dignified and calm place to communicate vulnerably with Ahasuerus so that then he was able to hear and understand the magnitude of the situation. You can just imagine if she had run into the throne room like screaming and freaking out, nothing would have happened. Ahasuerus wouldn't have understood the magnitude. He wouldn't have reacted the way that he did. But by staying calm and staying focused on what is my goal, right? What is it I ultimately want to communicate? She could communicate in a calm way that then allowed her to stand in her dignified place that made Ahasuerus completely just want to do anything he could for her. Anything he could. So seeing this, we understand that being honest and vulnerable with how we feel and what we want allows us to deal with the situation with beauty and grace, right? We can be like Esther, and it inspires our husbands to hear and honor our feelings and desires, right? We give them the space. We give ourselves the space to be heard, to express ourselves, and we give them the space to hear us so that we can, you know, we then, like, we're setting ourselves up for success. We're setting ourselves up to be heard. We feel important and we give them the space to hear us as well. So we'll continue next week, please God, with the third step that Esther took that allowed her to be the amazing woman that she was, and that we continue to learn from. And you know, we're meant to remind ourselves of this story every year. We have to read it twice, so there must be something that we're meant to get from this. And I'm really excited to share more of this with you on next week's Coffee and Connection. The second point was expressing ourselves vulnerably, right? Being able to vulnerably and calmly, and the power that has, even in those moments when we feel, especially in those moments when we feel so overwhelmed with emotion. If we express ourselves in that overwhelmed state, we're not able to be heard, right? You ever had, like, when someone, your kid comes in and they're screaming, "Oh my gosh, listen!" You're like, "Wait, calm down. Wait, what happens?" And, like, you need them to talk calmly. You need them to take a deep breath and then tell you what happens, right? We learned that from Esther, that she took time for herself to get in touch with who she is and why she needed to do this. And then from a regal, dignified place, she expressed herself vulnerably. And then we'll see next week the third step that she was able to take. So thank you all for being here with me on this journey. I love bringing these ideas in, and I'm glad that you're all with me on that, that you're excited about it as well. Thank you for your beautiful comments. And I look forward to connecting with you next week on Coffee and Connection. And until then, may we all be blessed to live, love, and be loved with all our hearts. Goodbye for now. Yoshua, you want to say goodbye? Thank you for your patience. Bye.